Thank you, Jerry. Good evening, Shabbat Shalom to everybody. It's wonderful to be here. I feel rather humbled by the honor of being asked by Bet Amen to speak before you, to share a Dvar Torah. And I thought I would begin by telling you a little bit about myself so you'll know where I'm coming from. I was born in Brooklyn, like most nice people, in 1947, shortly after the Shoah. My father was a secular Polish Jew who came to Palestine with his non Zionist parents in 1919 because his father couldn't make a living in their town in Poland. After a few years, he found he couldn't make a living in Yafo, almost becoming Tel Aviv at the time, and uh, and so off he went to New York, and the rest of the family followed in 1931. By no effort of intention, I sort of followed in my father's footsteps. Born in Brooklyn, at 3, the family, because of issues with relatives in Israel and the polio epidemic, we moved to Israel. We made Aliyah to Israel when I was 3, and we lived for a while on a kibbutz, and I'd love to spend the whole evening telling you all these wonderful things, but I'll try not to do that so I can get to the Dvar Torah. But then we went back to the States. Then I went again to Israel when I was 13 with my grandfather, stayed in Israel, served in the army, and lived on a kibbutz, and then in Jerusalem, and then came to the States to go to college in New York, which is, of course, the center of the universe, not quite the umphalos, the belly button that Jerusalem is, but approaching it. And my mother was a secular American Jew who loved God, was born to Romanian parents in Brooklyn. My mother's Romanian father, Papa to me, went to Cheder as a child and came to New York City around 1920. All of these were Zionists and socialists. Papa convinced my parents I should be bar mitzvahed, to which they reluctantly agreed. We were living in Puerto Rico at the time. There was a conservative synagogue there, Shaarei Tzedek, and I got a stack of 78 RPM records. Children, you can ask your grandparents what that means. And thus learned Behalotcha, which was my haftarah. Later, I spent years of childhood and high school in Israel, kibbutzim in town. I hold dual citizenship. I always knew I was Jewish and that God is real and that love is my guide because my mother told me so. And despite great peregrinations into something that is also a Jewish minhag of going off to what we call in Hebrew misuot zarim, the torch, strange torches. But years ago, I somehow made a turn and started on my way back to Judaism and met a lot of friends on my way. Now I'm in my 75th year, and I see I'm following a well-trodden path. I'm learning so much, and more than anything, plumbing the, not learning plumbing, but plumbing the profound depths of my ignorance. So here is a crumb from the blessed and infinite bakery of Torah and Yiddishkeit. May it bring a smidgen of nourishment to you. This week's portion that is read in the synagogue is Parashat Shoftim. Parashat Shoftim is one of the more extensive and comprehensive parashot. It covers a whole lot, and it's really quite daunting. One of the changes that Rabbi Morrison brought to Beth Am's Torah study was to follow in our Torah study the order of Parashat HaShavua, the generally recognized subdivision of the Torah into weekly portions. Now, at first, I resisted this approach, but just because old habits die hard and I didn't want to change, but it didn't take me long to realize that it opened easy access to many treasures in the now, things that are going on. You can check out the Parashat HaShavua on hundreds of websites and hear the opinions, the range of thought that is going on today. And it really gave me a very strong feeling of the continuity of Judaism throughout time and throughout space. And being Reformed Jews, we can have our cake and eat it too. And so we simply also took over, the lay people, took over our Torah study for Sunday, and we continue as we did before, going sentence by sentence, verse by verse, through the Torah, and we love that, and there are reflections, and it's wonderful. So I invite you to both our Torah studies because you're sure to enjoy them. Now, I learned through taking on the teaching of a couple of these Sunday parashot where to find stuff, where to find what the Jews think about this week's parasha or this week's verse, whichever it is we were headed for. And one of the resources that I recently discovered was it's now a book called Covenant and Conversation by the great Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks, Zichrono Livracha. He's an amazing teacher, and you get a lot out of his thoughts. And what he does is this book has 3 different approaches of his own to each parasha, and it is so enlightening. It's got so much bandwidth in it. We are in Silicon Valley, excuse the expression, but this is, it's kind of amazing. So that has informed some of what I want to share with you tonight. And I do recommend that to anyone who wants to study the parashot. Now, a quick glance at Rabbi Sacks's writings on Parashat Shoftim reveals the immense scope of issues addressed by this week's portion. For one thing, in this parasha, in these verses from the Torah, we read what ultimately became the structuring of my mind is blanking. You know the expression, the division of labor among the executive, help somebody, legislative, and the judicial. Thank you so much. Yes, who needs a memory when you have such lovely friends? That comes from this parasha, where the kingdom is to be divided into three branches of management, you could say. The king, the Kohanim, that is, the priests, and the Levites, the people doing the practical work surrounding Jewish worship. That in itself uh, merits more than one Dvar Torah, and it's wonderful to see how in our non-kingly democracy we have preserved the values that are expounded in that segment. Then there are many other portions, but I realized, in fact, I was a Toastmaster for a while. I was trying to follow in the footsteps of my wife, who was president of our local Toastmasters chapter, and I learned many things through her by her telling me and also nudging me to go and join Toastmasters so that I could get it, as it were, from the horse's mouth. And one of the things I learned is that if you want to communicate something, pick one focal point. Don't try and tell a great deal, although it's hard for some of us to avoid. So I picked one of the central injunctions of this parasha. That is, we are enjoined, we are commanded to chase after justice. Tzedek, tzedek tirdof, it says in Hebrew. Tzedek, of course, is justice. Tirdof means to chase after. And the two words really informed my thoughts about this mitzvah, because I realized, okay, I'm going to chase tzedek, but what is tzedek? And I thought, well, it's being fair, it's being even-handed, it's doing the right thing. And I realized I had no good definition. Now, as a repentant mathematician, I owe some allegiance to the notion that before you start an argument, you ought to define your terms very carefully. And so, how can I pursue this mitzvah, pursue the mitzvah of tzedek, tzedek tirdof, if I don't even know what tzedek is? And I realized that that is the major thing that I want to encourage you to think about. When you find yourself, we talk a lot about tzedek in this congregation, and I'm glad that we do. It's an important value that we hold. But it's also important for us to know what it is we're talking about. It's not hard to find issues on which there are two or more sides. Palestine, Israel, need I say more? There are many other issues. There are more things. And one of the things that I want to encourage you to do is to seek out the opposing position on any point where you have decided you want to support tzedek in this area. They're not hard to find. We do have a web. And we have Google right down the street here. And so we can find those things. Now, okay, so what do you do if you don't have a definition? Well, a Supreme Court justice named Potter Stewart had to come up with a definition for obscenity in order to express his position on an issue that came to the court in 1965 about a movie that had one scene in it that some people found greatly objectionable, and he did not. And so, in writing his concurrence with the majority opinion, he said, "I shall not attempt today to further define the kinds of material I understand to be embraced within that shorthand description, hardcore pornography, and perhaps I could never succeed in intelligibly doing so. But I know it when I see it, and the motion picture involved in this case is not that." Well, that was an eye-opener for me. I knew the expression, I know it when I see it, but I've always thought it was a cop-out. And now I see that in digging into the riches, the unending riches of the Torah, that we can only go as far as we are able to go, and it's okay if you reach a point where you have to say, "I'll know it when I see it," and use that as a supporting argument, just for something out of the box and an original approach to understanding Torah. Now, there are Talmud commentaries suggesting that the doubling of the word tzedek refers to two things. One, the letter of the law, and the second, to compromise. So on the one hand, we have the precision of definition. On the other side, we have what is required for coming to terms in a varied society, not just among Jews, but among any people. And that is to accept that compromise is not an abandonment of tzedek, of justice, but rather is a tool that we need as a society. Well, there's much to go into here, and I've already said, seek out the advocates of opposing views because they can help you understand the issues, because the bottom line, as Ben Bagbag says in Pirkei Avot, is afoch ba ve'afoch ba dekule ba. That is the Torah. Turn it over and turn it over, for all things are within it. So I encourage myself and you to continue. Now, here in Bet Am, we have certain resources. I've already mentioned the web, God help us, and the many things that can be found in it, although it requires some sorting and sifting. But that is why we get such wonderful education here at Bet Am, and our untiring rabbis are always willing, and Cantor, I should add, are always willing to respond to any questions or notions that we may have and help us to understand them. So I encourage you to seek. If you're not from Bet Am, you belong to another congregation, seek out your rabbis. I'm sure they'll be happy to help you. So in sum, the pursuit of justice is important to us as Reformed Jews. Parashat Shoftim, this week's parasha, affirms the fundamental nature of this principle. May we all be wise, prudent, and successful in our pursuit of justice. Shabbat Shalom. Thank you.